Hi, I'm Caitlin.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
We're not from Memphis, but we love it.
Welcome to Memphis Type History, the podcast.
So, Rebecca, my idea for this episode is that I want you to talk type to us.
Talk type. Any type in particular?
Well, I think, so the name Memphis Type History kind of has, we've always felt like two sort of meanings, right? Mm-hmm. It has like, it's Memphis Type History, like Memphis-y history, told in a Memphis-y way, we think. And then it's also Memphis Typography History, but shortened because you're such a cool kid.
Well,
that you can just call it type.
People generally say type instead of typography. It's a little less of a mouthful. But yeah, initially this all began with typography, not a type of history. Yeah.
So, and I remember like when we were doing this book, like we kind of, I wouldn't say we were open to not calling it Memphis Type History, but I remember having some discussions about if it's going to reach a wider audience, like get further away from Memphis Type and then Memphis Type Illustrated and like get further from the art side. Like, can it still work as Memphis Type History? Like, can we add history to it and it still works? And I think with that kind of that double meaning, double feel of behind the meaning, I think it still works. But I thought since it really did start with typography, and that is really, I guess, like the main, I don't know, I guess they're equally the name, but that's kind of like the bridge of making it history went with the original like type theme.
And the underlying picture of it is just about every image that's a new image, or at least on my end, is focused on the type. So it's usually the signage or there's some type within that landmark. Mostly it's interesting on itself, so it makes for a good visual. But yeah, every painting except for one has type, and we explained that in our intro episode.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you're not really sure, like I think to listen to this episode, you need to go back and listen to, if you haven't yet, you need to go back and listen to our intro episode where we discuss the history of the project, because we're not going to do that again. We're diving right in.
Yeah. And I don't even know what to expect because I just found out about this episode this morning.
So let's start. Like you said, you were focused on the typography. Why don't you talk a little bit about what typography is? Like, let's start at the basics.
Okay. The typography is type, fonts. How about that? Text. Type is a letter form, and letter forms can be made by hand. They can be made on the computer. I'm trying to think of a creative other way to make type. Typesetting. They're like letterpressing. They have these letters made out of wood or metal to create different prints. So yeah, letter form is an art form, in my opinion. There are over, 3 fonts in the world. I say 3 because obviously that's true. There are lots and lots, and it's endless. You could create as many types of type as you want. It's because it is an art, and people are now. It's become such a trend to create. Or I don't want to say trend, but
it's becoming like a more appreciated thing.
Yeah,
I don't think it's necessarily a trend.
Well, I was just thinking, so many people can have the ability to create their own letter form. Like they can create their own type and give it a name, and put it out through technology. For people to purchase their own type.
And then there's also type like totally custom. Like you can make a font out of like these letter forms that you create, or you can like make a logo or like paint signage. Like you've done some signage in some businesses around Memphis, I know. And that's type.
Yeah. So what I love about sign painting in particular is in olden days, I'm really terrible with numbers, so I couldn't push out years or dates or whatever. But it was very common for painters to come out to a business and paint the signage on their building. And a lot of times that would end up becoming the logo, the letter forms that they would paint on the building. And a lot of times it was just that people needed a sign to advertise what was inside of the store, the business. But I did love that carrying over of what the artist produced in the typography for the business to advertise became their actual logo. And so in some cases, I've been able to do that even today in the 2000s.
So give us some examples of where we can see how you've worked your magic with type in Memphis.
Okay. Magic. It's not magic. It's just a hobby art form, I guess. Prop Seller was one, and they wanted a sandwich board because they started out and they shared a shop with Barefoot Bride. So they were out in the back, so they kind of needed their own standing sign. And I hand painted that, and that turned it into vector, the letters. So that was the logo that you can find on their website now. And most currently 409 South Main, which is an event space downtown on South Main. The top floor is events, bottom floor is going to become a market, so it's also South Main Market. And just being how historic that building is, it just felt appropriate to give them their own letter form. And I created an alphabet for them so that I'm going to be painting their windows in a couple of weeks for their lounge areas. So I'll be using the letters that I created for them and just put, on these windows what they need, like private, ladies, gentlemen, that kind of stuff.
Cool.
That'll be fun.
So what does the process of creating typographic art, or I don't know, what do you want to call it? Like, what does it look like to create these letter treatments or whatever, type treatments, sorry.
I'd like to say a steady hand because I like to think I could have been a surgeon. So steady hand, good sense of spacing between letters, which is also known as kerning, and a full letter to tracking is what you would call for the spacing between all the letters in a unit for like a word. That's probably more info than people care, but yeah, a good sense of space, composition, steady hand. But yeah, typography now, like, it is interesting because it's so easily accessible. Just finding a good font out in the world is sometimes just as suitable as creating your own, for sure. But yeah, with Memphis Type, it did start with a guy who also was interested in the interesting signs and typography that he found in Memphis. And it was great for me to come during that time because it was kind of quick access to be like, oh, this is in Memphis? Like, that's gorgeous. And because I like painting, it's fun to paint. It was fun to paint those letters that we see in Memphis because each sign has its own set of type of different letters that are all I consider to be interesting.
So can you talk a bit about the difference of like coming up with type in your own head, like for a logo or for some or for a project you're working on or whatever, and like painting it from another reference?
The difference?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just tell us about that because you do both.
Yeah. Painting the signs, which is where this started, it's really just about paying attention to detail. So not only am I looking at the different shapes and sizes of the fonts within each other or the different characters of the sign between each other, but also noticing the lighting that's happening between each letter. So taking note of different shading and different flaws that are within the text and trying to capture all those little details to create a realistic sense, but also give it that illustrated style of what a sign looks like in Memphis. Whereas to just create from scratch, I just have to look at, okay, what's the era that I want to go with? and kind of look and kind of go back and get inspired by that style of fonts from those times. And then I try to think of like, well, how can I merge styles that I like that would be appropriate for what I'm going for? And it comes, I end up hand lettering maybe 2 to 3 different options. If I really want to hand letter something, it doesn't always stick with the first one that I go with. Sometimes I'll do a couple. And what's interesting is even if I go in with the same inspiration and the same direction, they end up looking completely different. And you can have a completely different feel because just the slightest change of what you do to a character can change the overall outcome of the feel. So even just adding, just between sans serif and serif fonts, sans serif is without feet and serif is with feet, if that makes sense. And so even if I hand letter something with that looks partially like I've added a serif to it, it changes the aesthetic of it, changes the feel, makes it a little less, makes it less avant-garde or less modern, but maybe gives it just the right touch of maybe sophistication, or we need to age it a little bit, or, that kind of a thing. I hope some of this makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So when you're hand lettering, let's say even just for like your own self. So like it's a project you want to work on. Either you're doing it from reference or like you've done some like states. I think you like hand letter the names of some states.
Yeah.
And that was like out of your own head, I think, right? Like you came up with a form. So what does that like, what kind of tools are you using? Where do you get, we could like, what kind of tools do you use? Like, how do you get inspired? And you've kind of talked a little bit about like looking at different eras to like figure out what kind of form you like the letters to take. But like, what does that process look like? Like if you're going to do, like, let's say you're Florida painting the block with Florida painted on it. Like walk us through, like, how did you pick why the letters look the way they look, the colors, like, and then like how'd you get inspired? And then like, what tools do you even use to do it? Like, take us through the process.
So the little states ones, because that was just for fun, those were based on states that I visited and how I view them. What letters could I create that reminded me of that place? And the reality is I could have created, I don't know, at least 5 or more different styles of Florida that to me look like Florida at the same time. But it was just a matter of, it was just a good practice, a good, what's it called whenever you're exercise, to just sit down, do something for yourself so you're not worried about how to please a client. And it's a good way to practice an exercise of let me create some type that feels like the place that I'm thinking of. And wasn't even at that time, I wasn't even looking at different letter forms. I was just on my own hand drawing, because that's what it is. You're drawing and sketching out a style that you think is appropriate for what you're trying to capture. And with Florida, I used paints that I thought were appropriate, just visually what I remember seeing when I'm down there. I had to have a palm tree because palm trees are dear to my heart. So I had a little palm leaves to it. And then instead of using just pen and ink, I wanted to use paint because at the time that's the medium that I'd been using all the time. And so the more you practice, the more you refine your skill a little bit more and more. So I'm actually a little nervous because I haven't touched a paintbrush in a good amount of time.
So when you're doing it, do you just think of it in your head and you just like start painting?
Not with no, it always starts on the sketching block with the sketchbook and a pencil. And, because you want to, and you do it lightly because you want to know, well, how do these letters interact with each other? How do each character, do I want to connect them? Do I want them separate? Do I want certain spacing between certain letters to touch or not touch? And, within those letters, do we add flourishes to bring them more life within other characters within that word? How thin or how thick do we want them to read. And yeah, it's all serious. It really seriously is just creating an art. Like type, we see type as a human figure, but just not as complex, but essentially, or a character. Like a character is the same as a character, a person character or a type character. Mm. And how do we want to draw that character?
Cool. That's a cool, like, little soundbite explanation. The character thing. I like that.
We should put our exercises on this show notes.
Our exercises.
I could do that. I could put some I could put some roughs.
Oh.
And Caitlin, you could draw some characters.
I'm working on I'm learning hand lettering.
Oh, perfect.
But I'm doing it very high tech.
Is it calligraphy?
No, I'm doing. I mean, it's like I took a modern calligraphy class, so I have like a calligraphy pen and all of that now, and like ink and stuff, and some nibs, and so I've been playing with it. But I'm actually learning on my iPad more.
Oh wow! Yeah. I know, I want to get one of those Apple pens so bad.
It's really awesome. You would love it. Next time I see you, you need to play with mine.
I would love to.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by hand lettering. I'm interested in learning it, maybe using it a little bit design wise, but also just because it's something, I don't know, it's just like a cool way to like customize things. So I kind of want to dive in and learn a little more. So I've been learning a little on the side and working on it. But yeah, I'm very high tech with it, with the Procreate brushes and all of that. I was going to ask you, do you sketch on the block? Like, do you sketch out what you're doing with type before? Because I know, like, with your paintings, you don't sketch. You paint in layers.
Correct.
Do you do that with your typographic paintings as well, or do you put the letters on there?
No, it's different. It is different. Okay. And thanks for pointing that out, because I don't want to sound like a hypocrite when I'm like, I don't put pencil on my canvas.
Can you explain? So since that's true that you do it differently, can you first explain how you paint and then explain how you do your typographic pieces? Because people don't know what I mean when I say like you're painting in layers or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So with the painting, as I'm seeing the landscape or whatever I want to paint, even the signage with letters, I just paint by background first and then your foreground. Make sure that generally I try to keep the background cool and the foreground hot so that it really stands out and becomes a focal point. But yeah, so this is where things can get tricky. Is it's better for me not to use pencil because on the canvas, because then my brush strokes look different. And I say that because let's say I paint a square in a background. It wouldn't make sense for me to paint the background by painting around a square figure. It makes more sense to go ahead and just paint the full background so it's a nice flush, smooth background. And you can see that your brush strokes are at a certain angle, and you're not going to get that, which is great for like abstract painting, or, I mean, it works for some paintings, but for me, I like to see angled brushes in the same direction for the most part. So I would paint the background first, or at least for the most part, and then the foreground would lay on top of that. So it gives it a really nice formation, I think. And so here's the problem with it, though, is I have had to redo not a full painting, but a portion of the painting because I've misspelled signage. So that happened with Leahy's. I was so mad. I spelt it without the H, and I had to repaint that arrow. And paint's not cheap, so I have to not think about it. But yeah, but it'll happen. And because I want the arrow to have like the right blending and the right background below the letters. And so I could, on top of the paint, maybe pencil in the letters, but then I'm worried that I'll end up wanting to erase, and then it'll leave erase marks on it or something, you know? And I don't want to have to color correct my paint to touch up or anything like that, which I have had to do that before. If I make a mistake, I'll try my best to color correct, which is where color theory class comes in handy. Mm-hmm. You learn how to match the paint colors. So that's painting. So that's just, I see an image I like, I just start painting it on a canvas. And I think it also helps with individuality. So it shows more of an illustrated style. It looks like my handprint because it's the way that I see an image and portray it on the canvas is if I just paint it. With lettering, I will sketch out and refine it on the paper first. And once I get it the way I want it, which is after I've erased it a bunch of times or, decided, okay, I'm going to ink this now. I'm going to put in an ink or I'm going to really outline this in dark letter or dark, set of type that I really like. Then I copy that onto the wood or canvas. Well, probably not canvas. It's usually wood. And I have these, I don't do large scale typographic lettering. I mean, I have, and I've done this and it takes forever. It's easy for me to use carbon paper.
Okay.
Are you familiar with carbon paper? Well,
I know it's a real old thing and you think I wouldn't be, but I am in fact familiar with it.
Oh, okay. Well, I only know about it because my dad was was a carpenter, and he used carbon paper a lot.
Yeah, I've used it for like making receipts, like working concession stands, like receipts and like some other stuff too. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just trace my sketch onto the wood.
Okay.
And the reason why is because with letters, they are they don't need soft edges. They can have. So what I'll do is I'll paint the background and then carbon copy my type over it and then paint the type.
And maybe this is a dumb question, but how do you paint it so that you can't see what you drew underneath?
I paint just slightly over the carbon marks.
Okay. Very steady hand. But
yes, with the steady surgeon hand.
Let me think. Do I have any other questions about type or typography? Yeah. So if anyone listening wants to get into type, learn more about it, experience it in various ways, what would you recommend? What would you recommend for someone who wants to become a better appreciator of typography? And what would you say to someone who wants to maybe dig into it and actually learn how to do it with their own hands?
Well, I wouldn't mind putting in the show notes different, because I do love I don't just love hand lettering. I love hand lettering, but I also do really love just typography. And there are some good books that are Thinking with Type that we can learn about what typography is and how it's progressed through the ages.
Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Because that plays into what we're talking about specifically here, sign painting, hand lettering, what your art, that kind of stuff, all that, it all blends together. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be able to create the characters I do now without having an understanding, I think, of just general typography.
Yeah.
But then, and then I could post some tips, or like I said, I could post some rough sketches that I've done in the past of progression of different type. And there's different ways to do it. Some people are real accurate and they use the ruler. I use a ruler, but not all the time. But I could probably look up some good sources of people. There are so many people that I would put above my skill set on hand lettering. But I'm more than happy to put my own work and thoughts and anything that can help people to get inspired by it and want to get their hands into it, for sure.
Yeah. You definitely made me more of an appreciator of it, just in general. So I think other people might feel the same when they dig in.
I hope so.
Anything else that you think we should know about type, or how type has to do what it has to do with Memphis Type History? Anything to add?
Well, I'm just glad that Memphis grew at a slow pace, because so many of these signs got left behind, and then they became much more appreciated because people like us got to see them.
And Memphis still has its typographic history.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for talking type.
You bet. Thanks for asking, I guess.
As usual, everyone, head over to patreon.com/Memphis Type History to support the show. We would so appreciate it. You can even get some stuff in return. Also, if you want show notes, if you want to go see all that cool stuff Rebecca's going to add and show you, go to memphistypehistory.com/type, TYPE.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for your questions, Caitlin. This is Memphis Type History, the podcast.
We like your type.
You've been listening to Memphis Type History, the podcast. It would mean so much to us if you head over to iTunes and give us a rating and review. Be sure to subscribe and never miss an episode.
Want to be part of Memphis Type History and get behind-the-scenes content, merch, and more? Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Memphis Type History. That's Patreon, spelled patreon.com/Memphis Type History.
Find more Memphis Type History on our blog at memphistypehistory.com, on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest as Memphis Type History, and on Twitter at Memphis Type.